What if I told you there's a drink that can give you focus, steady energy, and less of that jittery crash, and it's not coffee? I'm not talking about some miracle detox tea or a supplement some influencer is selling you. I'm talking about something you can find in almost any grocery store that scientists have actually studied for how it affects attention, alertness, and sleep. It's matcha, that vivid green powdered tea you've probably seen in lattes. Now, before you click away thinking, here we go, another matcha ad, I want to be upfront about something. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nutritionist, and I'm not going to tell you that matcha replaces coffee in some magical absolute sense. What I am going to do is walk you through what the actual research says, the real mechanisms, the real limitations, and where the science is genuinely solid versus where it's still early. Because there's a lot of noise out there about matcha, and a good chunk of it isn't backed by anything more than a wellness blog quoting another wellness blog. So if you've ever wondered whether switching your morning coffee for a glass of matcha is actually backed by science or just backed by marketing, stick around. By the end of this, you'll know exactly what the evidence supports, what it doesn't, and how to think about making the switch for yourself. And yes, we're going to be honest about who should probably just not do this, or at least talk to their doctor first. Let's get into it. Let's start with coffee itself, because to understand why someone might want an alternative, you have to understand what coffee is actually doing to your body. Coffee's main active ingredient is caffeine, and caffeine works by blocking a molecule called adenosine from binding to its receptors in your brain. Adenosine is the chemical that builds up over the course of your day and makes you feel sleepy. When caffeine blocks it, your brain essentially stops receiving the get tired signal, which is why you feel more alert. That's the whole trick. It's not that caffeine is giving you energy out of nowhere. It's masking your body's natural fatigue signal. That's a genuinely useful mechanism. And coffee has real, well-documented benefits for alertness and mental performance. This isn't an anti-coffee video. But there are a few things about the way caffeine behaves that are worth understanding, especially if you feel like your coffee habit isn't working for you the way it used to. First, timing matters a lot more than most people realize. There's a well-known sleep study conducted by researchers at the Henry Ford Sleep Disorders and Research Center and Wayne State University, published in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine, where participants were given 400 milligrams of caffeine, which is roughly 2 to 3 cups of coffee, at different points before bedtime, right at bedtime, 3 hours before and 6 hours before. What they found was that even when caffeine was taken 6 hours before bed, it still significantly reduced total sleep time, cutting it down by more than an hour based on objective sleep monitoring. And here's the part that really stood out to the researchers. The participants often didn't consciously feel like their sleep was disrupted. Their sleep was measurably worse, but they weren't necessarily aware of it. That's worth sitting with for a second. If you're someone who has an afternoon coffee and then wonders why you're tossing and turning at 11 p.m., this is likely part of the answer. And you might not even connect the two, because the caffeine doesn't feel like it's still active by then. Second, caffeine has a real, measurable effect on your body's stress response. When you drink caffeine, it triggers a release of cortisol and adrenaline, the same hormones involved in your body's stress and fight or flight response. That's part of why caffeine feels energizing. It's not just blocking fatigue signals, it's also nudging your stress hormone system. For most healthy people in moderate amounts, this isn't dangerous. But it does help explain why some people feel wired, anxious, or on edge after coffee, especially on an empty stomach or in higher doses. Third, and this one is really just physiology, not really a criticism of coffee. Caffeine is a mild diuretic, meaning it can increase urination. Research reviewed by Mayo Clinic notes that while caffeine does have this mild diuretic effect, the fluid you're drinking in your coffee generally offsets it, so moderate coffee drinking doesn't meaningfully dehydrate you. I want to be clear about that because coffee dehydrates you is one of those claims that gets repeated constantly online without much nuance. The actual research says the effect is real but small, and mostly canceled out by the fact that you're drinking a liquid. And finally, there's the crash. A lot of people describe an afternoon slump after their morning coffee wears off, a kind of coming down feeling. This is generally understood as a combination of your adenosine receptors catching up once the caffeine clears your system, plus normal blood sugar fluctuations if you had something sugary alongside your coffee. It's not something that's been isolated in a single definitive study the way the sleep research has, but it's a widely reported and mechanistically plausible experience, and it's one of the most common reasons people go looking for alternatives in the first place. So to sum up part one, coffee isn't bad. It has real backing for improving alertness and focus, but it comes with a specific profile, a fast spike, a possible crash, a stress hormone bump, and sleep effects that can linger far longer than most people expect. That's the gap a lot of people are trying to fill when they go looking for something else, and that's where matcha comes in. Quick primer, because a lot of people use matcha and green tea interchangeably, and they're not quite the same thing. Regular green tea is made by steeping tea leaves in hot water and then removing the leaves, so you're only getting whatever compounds dissolved into the water. Matcha is different. The tea leaves are grown, often shaded before harvest, then dried and ground into a fine powder. When you make matcha, you're not steeping and discarding leaves. You're whisking the entire powdered leaf into the water and drinking all of it. That distinction matters, because it means you're consuming more of the actual leaf material, including compounds that might otherwise stay behind in discarded tea leaves. Some nutrition sources point to this as the reason matcha is often described as more concentrated than a typical cup of steeped green tea. Though I'll be honest with you, the exact multiplier you'll see thrown around online varies wildly depending on which site you read, and a lot of those specific numbers trace back to marketing material rather than a consistent, independently replicated measurement. So rather than quote you a number I can't verify, I'll just say, matcha is a more concentrated form of green tea because you're consuming the whole leaf rather than an infusion of it. What matcha actually contains that's relevant to this conversation are two things, caffeine and an amino acid called L-theanine, and it's really the combination of those two that's the interesting part of the science here. Not just matcha has caffeine so it wakes you up, but a specific studied interaction between these two compounds. Here's where I want to slow down because this is the part of the video where I actually want to show you real peer-reviewed research, not just tell you studies show. L-theanine is an amino acid found almost exclusively in tea. On its own, research suggests it has a calming effect. It's associated with increased alpha brainwave activity, which is a pattern linked to a relaxed but wakeful mental state, similar to what's sometimes seen during light meditation. That's the mechanism people point to when they describe matcha as giving calm energy rather than jittery energy. But the more interesting research isn't about L-theanine alone, it's about L-theanine combined with caffeine, which is exactly the combination you get naturally in a cup of matcha. There's a randomized controlled trial, published in the journal Nutrition and Neuroscience, that tested a combination of roughly 97 milligrams of L-theanine and 40 milligrams of caffeine against a placebo in a group of 44 young adults. The researchers measured cognitive performance, self-reported alertness, blood pressure, and heart rate before and after the dose. What they found was that the combination significantly improved accuracy on a task-switching test, basically a measure of how well people could shift attention between different types of tasks, and it significantly increased self-reported alertness while reducing self-reported tiredness. It's worth noting, this same study found no significant effect on some other cognitive tasks, like visual search or mental rotation. So the benefit wasn't across the board. It showed up specifically in attention switching and subjective alertness. That's one study, so let's cross-check it. A separate trial published in the British Journal of Nutrition tested a higher dose, 200 milligrams of L-theanine with 160 milligrams of caffeine, specifically in people who'd been kept awake overnight, so already sleep-deprived. Using both reaction time tests and brainwave monitoring, the researchers found that this combination improved measures of selective attention compared to a placebo, even under sleep-deprived conditions. Again, a different lab, different dose, different population, and it points in the same general direction. Caffeine plus L-theanine together seem to support attention and alertness more than what you'd expect from a vague tea makes you calm narrative. And to zoom out even further, there's a systematic review and meta-analysis, meaning researchers pooled data across multiple existing trials rather than running just one experiment, ERIS, that looked specifically at the combined effects of caffeine and L-theanine on attention. It found that the combination improved attention-switching accuracy and had what the researchers described as a moderate effect on alertness within the first couple of hours after consumption. Importantly, this same review also noted that L-theanine's effects on cognition in general have been described as promising but not completely conclusive, which is a pretty honest, unflashy way for scientists to say, there's something real here, but we don't have the full picture yet, and not every trial agrees on the size of the effect. So here's my honest summary of this part of the science. The caffeine plus L-theanine combination does have real replicated evidence across multiple independent trials in different labs for improving attention and subjective alertness, and possibly doing so with less of the jittery, anxious quality that caffeine alone can produce in some people. That's a legitimate research-backed mechanism. What it is not is a guarantee that you'll feel zero crash, or that it works identically for everyone, or that it's been proven to outperform coffee by some specific percentage. If you see a number like matcha gives you 6 hours of smooth energy, be skeptical. I could not verify a specific duration figure like that from any of the actual trials I looked at. What the research supports is a mechanism and a direction of effect, not a precise number of hours. Okay, quick pause. If you've ever tried matcha and hated it, or tried it and loved it, drop a comment right now telling me which one. I read these, and I'm genuinely curious whether people's experience matches what the research says or whether it's all over the place. Also, if you're the type of person watching this with a coffee in your hand right now, no judgment. I want to hear that too. All right, back to it. Let's talk numbers, because this is where I want to be really careful, since a lot of matcha content online throws out very specific, very confident milligram figures that don't actually hold up when you check multiple sources. What we can say with reasonable confidence based on institutional sources like Mayo Clinic and the FDA's general caffeine guidance is that a typical 8-ounce cup of brewed coffee contains somewhere around 95 to 100 milligrams of caffeine, and that 4 cups of coffee, about 400 milligrams, is the daily ceiling considered safe for most healthy adults. Matcha, on the other hand, generally contains meaningfully less caffeine per serving than a cup of coffee. Most sources I found put it somewhere in a broad range below what you'd get from coffee, though I'm intentionally not going to give you one precise number, because the estimates across different sources varied quite a bit, depending on how much matcha powder is used, the grade of the matcha, and how it's prepared. That variation itself tells you something. Matcha isn't a standardized product the way, say, a shot of espresso is. Different brands, different growing regions, different processing, it all shifts the caffeine content. So the practical takeaway isn't matcha has exactly this many milligrams of caffeine. It's matcha generally gives you a real but more moderate dose of caffeine than a cup of coffee, and it's paired with L-theanine, which, based on the research we just went through, appears to change how that caffeine feels and how your attention responds to it, rather than just being a weaker coffee. Now let's talk about the other thing matcha gets a lot of attention for: antioxidants, specifically a compound called EGCG, epigallocatechin galat. This is one of the main catechins, a category of plant compounds found in green tea. Multiple peer-reviewed reviews describe EGCG as having antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties, and researchers have studied it for potential links to cardiovascular health. things like supporting healthy cholesterol levels and blood pressure, as well as some early research into cognitive and neuroprotective effects. I want to underline the word early there because a lot of this research, especially around things like Alzheimer's prevention or long-term cognitive protection, is still in a preliminary stage. Some of it comes from population studies, meaning researchers look at large groups of people over time and note associations, like people who regularly drink green tea appear to have somewhat lower rates of cognitive decline. But association isn't the same as proof of cause and effect. There could be other lifestyle factors at play in people who drink tea regularly. It's also worth flagging that some of the more dramatic claims you'll see about EGCG, things like it being dramatically more powerful than vitamin C as an antioxidant, trace back to sources that I couldn't independently cross-verify with a second, higher quality source. So I'm leaving that kind of specific comparative claim out of this video entirely, because rule one for me making this video was, if I can't verify a number, I don't say the number. What I can say, based on genuinely peer-reviewed review articles, is this. Green tea, and by extension matcha, contains catechins, most notably EGCG, that have documented antioxidant properties and are an active area of cardiovascular neuroscience research. Some of the research is well established, like modest cholesterol benefits shown across a large pooled analysis of over 3,000 people across dozens of trials. Some of it is much earlier stage and shouldn't be treated as settled science yet, particularly around brain health and disease prevention. And matcha likely delivers more of these compounds than a typical steeped cup of green tea, for the simple reason that you're consuming the whole ground leaf rather than just what dissolved into the water during steeping. Let's get to the actual question in the title, because I promised you an honest answer, not a sales pitch. Based on what we've walked through, here's my honest read. Matcha is not a proven direct one-to-one biological substitute for coffee, in the sense of identical effect, just from a different plant. That's not how the research is set up, and no legitimate study I found made that specific claim. What the research does support is something a little more nuanced and, I think, actually more useful. Matcha delivers a real dose of caffeine, generally more moderate than coffee, combined with L-theanine, a compound that multiple independent, peer-reviewed randomized trials have linked to improved attention switching and increased subjective alertness, potentially with a smoother experience than caffeine on its own. On top of that, it comes packaged with catechin antioxidants that have decent, though not fully settled, evidence behind them for cardiovascular support, plus some earlier stage research into cognitive benefits that's promising, but genuinely not conclusive yet. So if your goal is, I want to feel alert without quite as much of the jittery, anxious edge, and I'd like a somewhat gentler caffeine dose, the evidence reasonably supports trying matcha as an alternative and testing how your own body responds. If your goal is, I need the exact same jolt I get from a double espresso, see, matcha, generally having less caffeine, may not get you there, and that's just an honest expectation to set. I also want to be really clear about something. None of this research treats matcha as medicine. Nothing here should be read as matcha treating, preventing, or curing any condition, and it's absolutely not a substitute for any medication. If you're on blood pressure medication, heart medication, or you manage a chronic health condition, this is genuinely important. Please talk to your doctor before making a significant change to your caffeine intake in either direction, whether that's adding matcha, cutting coffee, or both. Caffeine generally doesn't directly cancel out how blood pressure medications work, but caffeine itself can raise blood pressure and make managing hypertension a bit more complicated. So consumer health resources generally suggest people with high blood pressure keep their overall caffeine intake from any source on the moderate side and check in with their prescriber about what moderate means for their specific situation. The same logic applies if you're on stimulant medications, thyroid medication, or anything where timing and absorption matter. Caffeine, including from tea, can interact with how well some medications are absorbed or how strongly they act. This isn't me being overly cautious for no reason. It's genuinely one of the more consistent things I've found across multiple health sources while researching this video. So it felt important to actually say it clearly rather than bury it in fine print. Okay, let's get practical. If you want to test this for yourself, and I do think test it for yourself is the right framing, since individual response to caffeine and L-theanine varies a lot, here's how I'd approach it. Start with real matcha, not a matcha-flavored product. A lot of matcha lattes and bottled drinks at coffee shops use a small amount of matcha powder mixed with a lot of sugar and syrup. If you're doing this for the caffeine and L-theanine mechanism we talked about, you want actual ground tea leaf whisked into water or milk, not a dessert. Don't assume more powder means more benefit. Because matcha isn't standardized the way a single espresso shot is, doubling your scoop doesn't give you a predictable doubling of anything. Start with a modest amount, notice how you feel, and adjust from there the same way you'd figure out your own tolerance for coffee. Pay attention to timing, using what we learned from that sleep study. If a coffee at 2 p.m. can measurably disrupt your sleep that night, even though you don't feel it, the same general logic likely applies to any caffeinated drink, including matcha. If your main issue is nighttime sleep quality, the fix isn't really swap to matcha. It's watch your caffeine cutoff time, regardless of which caffeinated drink you're having. If you're currently a multiple cups a day coffee drinker, consider a gradual transition rather than an abrupt swap. Caffeine withdrawal is a real, documented phenomenon. Headaches, fatigue, irritability, and it happens regardless of which caffeinated drink you're stepping down from or to. Cutting coffee out cold turkey and replacing it with a lower caffeine drink like matcha in one day is a pretty likely recipe for a rough couple of days. Stepping down gradually tends to be more comfortable, and track your total daily caffeine, not just your one glass. If you're having matcha in the morning and then coffee in the afternoon, or matcha plus other caffeinated drinks, that adds up. The general guidance from Mayo Clinic and the FDA, up to about 400 milligrams a day for most healthy adults, applies to your total intake across everything, not per drink. I want to spend a moment specifically on this because I think a lot of replace your coffee content skips it entirely. If you're pregnant or breastfeeding, general medical guidance points toward keeping total caffeine intake meaningfully lower than the standard adult limit. Talk to your doctor about what's appropriate for you, since this applies to caffeine from any source, matcha included. If you're on blood pressure medication, heart medication, stimulant medications, certain thyroid medications, or medications used around cardiac procedures, please don't just swap one caffeinated drink for another without a quick conversation with your doctor or pharmacist. As we covered earlier, caffeine can interact with how several of these medications work, or how your body responds to them. If you have an anxiety disorder, or you know caffeine tends to make you feel wired or panicky, matcha still contains real caffeine. The L-theanine may take the edge off for some people, but it isn't a guarantee, and there's no solid research claiming it eliminates caffeine sensitivity. And if you're generally healthy with no underlying conditions and no medications that interact with caffeine, this is really just a try it and see how you feel situation, the same way trying any new caffeinated drink is. So does one glass of matcha replace your morning coffee? Based on everything we've gone through, real randomized trials on caffeine and L-theanine, peer-reviewed reviews on green tea catechins, and solid institutional guidance on caffeine limits and interactions, my honest answer is it can be a genuinely research-backed alternative for a lot of people, particularly if what you're chasing is steadier, less jittery alertness, rather than the biggest possible jolt. But it's not a proven universal swap, it's not medicine, and it's not going to work identically for everyone, because caffeine sensitivity is such an individual thing. What I'd actually encourage you to do isn't to blindly trust me or any other YouTube video on this. It's to look at the studies I've linked below, notice where the evidence is strong versus where it's still early, and then actually experiment with your own body, ideally with your doctor in the loop if you're on any medication. That's the honest version of science-backed, not certainty, but a clear, checkable trail of evidence you can go verify for yourself. If this was helpful, let me know in the comments what you're currently drinking in the morning and whether you're going to give matcha a real, unsweetened try. And if you want more videos like this, ones that actually dig into the primary research instead of just repeating whatever's trending, subscribe, because that's exactly the kind of content this channel is built around. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.